new evidence that Donald Trump's hellish month is taking a toll on his standing and thus sending many Republicans into a panic about the midterms. So what we're about to report to you right now is something you kind of already know. Donald Trump's one of the least popular presidents ever, along with something that is actually really underappreciated by the political and media class, that Donald Trump's problems with governing and his aides' crimes are now weighing down his presidency. So while it's become sort of fashionable in political circles to say things like Trump is Teflon or his base never wavers, in a new poll tonight, his approval has fallen to 36%, a drop of 6% in this new CNN poll, and a full 61% of Americans view him unfavorably. And it gets worse, with those who strongly disapprove of Trump at 48%. Those are the kinds of voters who are likely to turn out against Trump in November. Independents also giving up on Trump. You can see it in this chart. They were all the way up at 47% just last month. And what you're looking at is a key data point slide, a huge shift to 31% that actually marks, get this, an all-time low for Trump among independents tonight. It has now been 3 weeks since Trump's campaign manager was convicted and his top fixer pled guilty to committing crimes to help elect him, plus, of course, the separate indictments of his congressional endorsers and the Bob Woodward reporting that has rocked this White House with serious evidence of incompetence and high-level revolt. Plus, of course, in these last 3 weeks, we also had the dramatic anonymous declaration of resistance by one of Trump's own senior aides. So all of this stuff is happening. And we in the news cover it for you, and people say, okay, what next? Well, tonight is what's next. The collective response in the country has people pulling further away from Donald Trump. You can see it in the gradual softening in this survey from multiple polls. This is from the polling experts over at 538. Trump needs approval in roughly the 40s for the GOP to have a realistic chance of holding the House, according to experts. And we know that because of the data. In elections since 1946, any decline in a president's approval hurts their party. A little bit less than it hurts them, but hurts. So as Trump drops 5 to 6 points, that can cost Republicans 2 points in the House. And with Trump at 36% tonight, well, where does that put him against his worst times? We're going to leave it up on the screen for you here. You can see, as compared to firing Comey, which was very controversial, or compared to when he had that widely panned summit with Putin, which many conservatives criticized, or Charlottesville. What you see currently on the far left, the 36% tonight, is a near record low, right on par with where he was after Charlottesville. And as Donald Trump plummets and the walls close in today, his own son concedes Trump has a circle of trust that is much smaller than they want.
I think there are people in there that he can trust. It's a much smaller group than I would like it to be.
Who do you trust?
Well, I'll keep that to myself.
And they're not family?
Well, obviously, yeah, I'm talking outside of family. I think that one goes without saying.
A much smaller group than they would like. That's a statement about who Donald Trump trusts. And if you think about it, it gets the whole concept backwards. We live in a democracy. It may not feel like that on certain days, but we do. And that means the important question is who the voters trust. And although the White House might be making all kinds of noise to distract you from this information on your screen, the fact is, voters do not trust or approve of Trump tonight. Overall, 61% view him unfavorably, and among independents, you see it down to 31%, which is a record-breaking low. Now, Donald Trump started his presidency with a resistance that was literally larger than his base because he lost the popular vote. Tonight, we can report, after everything that's happened, that resistance is growing. I'm joined now by former Maryland Congresswoman Donna Edwards, a political pollster Cornell Belcher, and Democratic strategist Julian Epstein. Julian, when you look at these numbers, sometimes we have to focus on the facts right in front of our face. Does it show that people are listening, and even those who, as I mentioned with independents last month, were up in the 40s, are dropping in response to what they've learned just in the last 3 weeks?
I think the obvious answer to that question is yes. August was kind of a scorched month, a scorched earth month for this White House. I don't think any White House has ever had an August that was as bad as the last month was, save for maybe August of 1973 in the Nixon White House. The numbers are going down, not just with independents, but with college-educated women with non-college-educated white men. So this is a situation that is just getting worse and worse. What's most remarkable to me about this White House is not just that they've boxed themselves in so many different situations with so many different scandals, is that they just have no idea how to kind of get themselves out of the mess that they're in. I mean, with every incident that we've seen, whether it's the Cohen plea or the Woodward book or the New York Times op-ed, they continue to make these matters worse. They continue to call more attention to it than they need to. It's like the guys in the White House are somewhere, and the president himself are somewhere like a cross between Mr. Magoo and a Bond villain. Everything they do in responding to these incessant crises that seem to happen on a daily basis just makes things worse and worse, and it's all showing up in the polling numbers. The worst thing, I think, for the president is the personal qualities, the qualities of trust, honesty, strength, intelligence. All of those numbers are very, very much down in the latest polls, and the reason that that's bad, Ari, is because those numbers are harder to move than the poll numbers on policy questions.
Donna?
Well, look, you can't get elected if people don't like you and they don't trust you. And I think that's the problem that Republicans are facing right now. The president's numbers, I think, are pretty baked in, but I don't think he's bottomed out yet. I mean, and he may retain that 30+% core. But, Democrats know that in district after district across the country that Trump has lost independence. Those are the voters who have to be won over in order to win those districts. There are, 23 or so districts where Hillary Clinton won, and they're up for grabs. And so I think that what we're going to see here is that Trump's numbers will continue to drag Republicans down. And they're running out of time. I mean, there is not really time to do anything else about that. And I think that Republicans, certainly on Capitol Hill, but around the country, are beginning to realize that.
Cornell, as a pollster, you operate in an environment where a lot of people had the aftershocks of 2016 and are skeptical of all polls. In fact, the bulk of national polls showed Hillary in the lead, and nationally she finished in the lead, but lost the Electoral College. So while it was a shockwave, and I think the media made a lot of mistakes in 2016 that we'll own up to, there has been a kind of an overreaction and even a fear to look at these numbers. I mean, I think there might be viewers, Cornell, right now who say, wait, if it's really this bad, how have I heard about this? Well, partly there's a lot of different stories, but how do you, as an expert, look at these numbers and the significance they tell you going into the midterms?
A couple things. One is around the 2016 numbers, and I have to defend polling. Ari, I don't think the polling wasn't a problem. I think the problem was the narrative, right? We always wanted it to be a forced two-way race, and a forced two-way race, Hillary did get closer to a majority of support, but it was never a two-way race. It was always a four-person race, because independents, third party, sort of the protest vote was bigger this time around than it has been before. So I think our narrative was wrong, and in 2012, the sort of public polling was right on. Part of the problem in polling is getting the universe right? So it is who is a likely voter, and what's really important, I think, for Democrats this time around, and I want to sort of caution us about this. I don't care how low Trump's job approval numbers drop. If we have the 2010 or the 2014 electorate again, Democrats are not going to take back the House, right? If we have an electorate that looks a lot younger and a lot more diverse than midterm elections typically do, I think Democrats have a fighting chance. If you have an electorate that is more upscale, and one of the things that I think is really important in those numbers is even a majority of white voters are now disapproving of Trump, and 55% of college whites are strong in disapproval of Trump. So it is not only just his disapproval numbers, but can Democrats generate enthusiasm among voters who are not typical midterm election voters to turn out in droves this time around? And that's where you get the polling, not exactly right, because the universes aren't exactly right.
So I want you all to stay with me. I want to dig into this discussion of the leadership of Donald Trump, along with the concerns about it. You have, of course, a hurricane heading towards the East Coast right now, a new concern about the president's environmental policy, which is also important. Now, take a look. Trump late today claimed that his own response to the crisis in Puerto Rico, he said, was positive. Of course, that Hurricane Maria left almost 3,000 Americans dead.
So I think that Puerto Rico was an incredible unsung success. Texas, we have been given A-pluses for. Florida, we've been given A-pluses for. I think in a certain way, the best job we did was Puerto Rico.
And while Trump is saying that in public, I want to report the New York Times had a big piece noting a private secret plan here to effectively dilute Obama restrictions on a key gas, methane, which can drive global warming. And this comes while the UN Secretary General is calling on world leaders to do the opposite, to take the threat of climate change more seriously.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, and we are at a defining moment. The leaders of the world need to step up.
Julian, I wonder if you could put that in context for us, what the Times has unearthed, what's going on in the administrative state, sort of behind the scenes, as we brace for this hurricane.
Well, Trump's saying that the Houston experience and the Puerto Rico experience and the hurricanes last year is the Baghdad Bob moment. Baghdad Bob, of course, being the Iraqi general who claimed during the American invasion in 2003 that the Americans were committing suicide and surrendering. This is the Baghdad moment. And when we talk about the self-inflicted wounds, this is Trump again kind of playing to the 30% of his voters, many of them kind of the 30% of the public who are his base, many of them being very low information, but the rest of the 2/3 of the country saying this guy is a little bit of a buffoon. Again, this is to the point about self-inflicted wounds. And the notion that he would say that on September 11th, when we commemorate 9/11, and in Puerto Rico, remember, we lost almost 3,000 Americans. The fact that he would not comprehend that on such a sacred and hallowed day is just insult to injury. The notion then on the methane issue, and these things tie together quite nicely, the notion that you would be making the climate change problem worse by loosening the rules on methane gas, and that's a major contributor to climate change, while the biggest hurricane in 30 years is getting ready to barrel down on the East Coast. Again, just tells you how completely out to lunch the White House staff and the president are on just like basic, fundamental, like no-brainer communications issues.
Well, you say that, and Donna, that ties into what Donald Trump does think of his supporters. The infamous Fifth Avenue line, of course, is an insult to supporters because who would want to be a member of a club that was so cultish it would support murder on Fifth Avenue? Take a look.
I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
But Donna, the independence chart that we're putting up in the context of all of these woes says the opposite. Those were people who were more with him, and they've looked at the last 3 weeks and they've turned.
Well, and, you know, maybe Trump was right about 36% of Americans. But here's the thing with the 2,975 Americans who died in Puerto Rico because of the president's neglect and incompetence. And I think what they see in the president is his inability to take responsibility and make changes, to say, I was wrong and we should do things differently. And his total lack of empathy for, for people who are suffering. And so, I look at that and then I see these methane gas rules changes. And of course, that's one in a line of changes around environmental policy that completely undo Obama-era policies. But he's given license, really, to his agencies, to the EPA, to undo all of these regulations. And so, what that 31% of independents see right now is, they're traveling in a very small minority with a president who has another very small minority of Americans who are with him.
And Cornell, pardon another obvious question, but sometimes it is part of my job. What does it tell you that they weren't shouting this new methane climate change policy from the rooftops, that they are trying to sneak it?
Oh, I'm going to let a big political secret out of the bag here, Ari. It is, if you want to be popular, you probably should do things that are popular, right? Rolling back.
Is that why they paid you the big bucks at the polling company?
But if you want to be popular, you have to do things that are popular. And this administration, his behavior aside, what have they been working on over the last 2 years? Rolling back ACA. There's not a majority mandate for rolling back ACA. Trying to destroy health care. That's not popular. Giving a big tax cut to really rich people, that's not a popular thing. If you want to be popular, you probably should do things that the majority of Americans actually want you to do.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.